Welcome to the New Life Stories channel. We hope you will have fun with us. Enjoy watching.
The heat outside seemed to melt even the asphalt. The wheels were too soft and the road made strange waves. Sheldon sat in the car, squinting against the pleasant cool breeze blowing from the air conditioner. The man had never imagined that he would have such a nice, comfortable car and that his name would become one of the most famous in town. A smile appeared on Sheldon's lips. He looked at his driver, remembering that he'd started out the same way, as a janitor at a factory, and then he'd gotten a job as a driver for the director. It had seemed like a dream job at the time, and then he found an old diary in his things. There Sheldon wrote down his plans, set goals for himself, and as soon as he reached one of them, immediately strived for another. Except that he had forgotten about the old diary, and he hadn't gotten to it for a long time. And then when Sheldon opened the diary and saw the dreams of a little boy, his plans that he made in early childhood, he realized that he had never come close to any of his goals. It seemed to him that, having grown up, he had lost faith in himself and stopped at what he had achieved. The young man began to work actively, saving every dime for his endeavor. When he quit his job and sold his small apartment, his girlfriend dumped him, saying she would never build her future with such a loser. Sheldon was hurt that the woman he loved with all his heart didn't believe in him. But he moved on with his life and had now reached the heights he had dreamed of before. Later, the girl tried to return to him, saying that she was wrong, that she loved and missed him, but Sheldon did not believe her. Now he realized that she was attracted to his money, and he didn't need a girl like that. Sheldon tried to push away the memories of his past life. He reached his destination, and when the driver parked, Sheldon got out of the car. The sun's rays immediately began to burn his skin. Sheldon wrinkled his nose slightly and pulled out his sunglasses to put them on. He tried to hide from the reporters rather than the sweltering, scorching rays. There must be a lot of journalists today, because Sheldon was opening another branch of his real estate agency, which gave jobs to many people in the city. Thanks to his honest work, he was able to win the hearts of many clients. Of course, he would have to give an interview, but Sheldon planned that it would happen a little later because first he needed to make sure that everything was in order and going strictly according to plan. The man didn't like to deviate from the plan and believed that if he deviated from it even a little bit, everything would surely fall apart. Sheldon smiled as he looked around at the festive balloon arch. He liked the logo design and the agency's color style. The man looked carefully at the neon sign above the entrance and entered the building. The employees immediately rushed to their boss and began to tell him what they had already accomplished. All the employees loved and respected Sheldon, holding on to their jobs because they couldn't find another boss as good. Sheldon was pleased that people appreciated what he was giving them and tried to work even harder to achieve their goals. Sheldon smiled as he made sure the buffet and treats for the people coming to the opening were ready. The man looked at the baskets of sweets and fruit and imagined how excited the children would be, as there were usually a lot of moms with children coming to the opening. They all knew that Sheldon would also take care of the children's program to please the little ones. The man didn't have children of his own yet, but he loved them and often organized various activities for them. Soon music was playing outside. Sheldon looked outside and saw that the first guests had already started to gather. Soon the host came on stage and started the festive program, followed by the dancers. Sheldon went out to watch the mesmerizing Oriental dances, hoping that the journalists would not disturb him with their microphones and cameras. The man was now watching the dancers deftly manipulate their bodies as they performed a belly dance. Suddenly someone pulled the man by the elbow. "Young man, I'm ashamed to ask for alms here. Please give me some money to buy a loaf of bread. And if you don't believe me that I want to buy food, then buy it for me yourself," said a hoarse voice. Sheldon heard the voice and turned around. Sheldon replied, "Yes, of course." He pulled $100 out of his pockets. On a day like this, he just wanted to trust people and not check to see if this grandmother really wanted to buy bread or if she was working for someone. The man handed the old lady the bill, and when she took the money and began to tearfully thank him, Sheldon was stunned. His gaze was fixed on the woman's earrings. The tarnished stones brought him back to a distant past for a moment. Suddenly Sheldon asked in a worried voice, "Where did you get those earrings?" The woman turned dramatically pale and stared fearfully at the young man standing before her. She seemed startled by the question. She shook her head. "I can't sell them to you," she said. Apparently, she had been offered to sell those earrings several times before, since she was so startled by the question. Sheldon repeated his question. "I'm not asking you to sell them to me. I was just asking where you got them from." "They were given to me by my late husband. He made them himself because jewelry was very hard to get in those days. They are exclusive and precious to me as a keepsake. That's why I can't sell them even if I starve to death. I don't ask for money for myself. I can go without food for a long time, but my granddaughter is bedridden and suffering. I have to take care of her. She is trying and doing her best to get back on her feet," the old lady explained. All of Sheldon's insides instantly turned cold. He remembered the hardest times of his life. He also remembered Mrs. Richardson, who was now standing in front of him begging for alms. Sheldon was born into a poor family, so his childhood was difficult. He remembers vividly how his father lost his job, came home drunk, and started yelling at his mother and him. He told them to get out of the house or he would beat them. He said he was not going to provide for them. Then the mother took her young son by the hand and, crying aimlessly, realized that her husband would not throw words to the wind because he had already beaten her and her son more than once. After spending the night on a park bench and feeding the boy an apple from a tree there, the woman didn't know what to do with herself. She decided to enlist the help of a friend to stay with her while her husband calmed down a bit. But when she entered her apartment, she was shocked to find her husband in bed with her best friend. Of course, she didn't ask her friend for help. The drunken people who were once around her laughed at her. Then the woman cried bitterly and accidentally ran into Mrs. Richardson. She fed the hungry mother and son and sheltered them in her small two-house house. Mrs. Richardson helped Sheldon's mother find work, and thanks to her, the woman was able to get back on her feet. Though she met a wonderful man who later became Sheldon's stepfather. Communication with Mrs. Richardson ended when the woman was given an apartment, and she went to live there. And now she was standing in front of Sheldon, asking him for money for bread, and he knew he owed her much more than that. After all, she had once kept him from starving to death. Sheldon asked her to see if he was right. "Mrs. Richardson," he turned to her. He had so often looked at her earrings, which immediately caught his attention. She had once told him how her husband had made and given her this piece of jewelry. That had been in early childhood, and now he saw those earrings again. The woman was surprised. "Do I know you?" Sheldon replied, "Do you remember years ago when you took in a woman with a small child? That child was me." Mrs. Richardson sighed and covered her face with her hands. She shook her head as if she could not believe that after so many years she would meet the very boy who had helped her care for her newborn granddaughter because the poor woman's daughter had died in childbirth. Journalists began to surround Sheldon, asking him questions, but at that moment he was completely uninterested in them. He often remembered Mrs. Richardson and her invaluable help, remembered her words, which always supported him and helped him move on. Mrs. Richardson used to say, "My boy, one day you will reach great heights. You will become great and famous, and one day you will also help someone in trouble." And now Sheldon has a great chance to repay kindness for kindness. But the woman disappeared into the crowd unnoticed by Sheldon when the journalist shadowed her. The man tried to find her, but to no avail. Mrs. Richardson seemed to have vanished. Sheldon was angry that he had been distracted from an important conversation and refused to be interviewed, offering to ask questions of the agency's staff. Sheldon went to the main office himself. He immediately called his mother and told her about this unexpected encounter. Of course, she remembered Mrs. Richardson. "Son, you must find her and be sure to help her. If it hadn't been for her, we might be at the bottom right now. If we survived, it's a great miracle because God himself gave you this meeting so we could thank her for her kindness," his mother said. Sheldon thought the same, so he started looking for the woman. His mother told him exactly where Mrs. Richardson had gotten the apartment. She regretted that she rarely visited her and eventually stopped going to see the woman altogether, and yet she had to be there to support her because Mrs. Richardson had become family to them. Sheldon pondered all of this for days. His men had managed to find information that Mrs. Richardson had sold her apartment, and no one knew anything about where she had moved to. They tried to find her by name, but the search was going too slowly. Sheldon became obsessed with finding this woman and helping her granddaughter get back on her feet. He remembered the little girl looking at him with her big eyes and crying. Jacob was annoyed by the baby's crying, but it stayed in his heart forever as a pleasant memory. The man often went to his new branch, where he hoped to meet Mrs. Richardson, but it was all in vain. Sheldon did not understand why she had run away, but she neither waited for him nor accepted his help. Sometimes he thought it was just a fleeting vision, a figment of his imagination. But after a couple of weeks, Sheldon got a call saying they'd managed to find Mrs. Richardson. She lives in a resort community not far from where she met Sheldon. She lives in poverty in a house with a leaky roof. Sheldon put all his business aside and drove to the address given in the message. The man was afraid that Mrs. Richardson would not want to accept his help. After all, she had not just run away then. But as soon as he pulled up to the yard, the woman came out onto the porch and was very surprised. Upon seeing Sheldon, she burst into tears. "Son, I never thought you would decide to find me and come to me. Forgive me, I have nothing to feed you. I bought flour, yeast, and grits with your money so I could at least bake some porridge pies. I'd also bought medicine for Haley. She's gotten really weak. She's trying to get up, but she's having a hard time, or rather, she can't get up at all. Why did you run away? I wanted to help you." Mrs. Richardson frankly admitted, shrugging her shoulders. "I don't know. I'm used to doing everything myself. No one has ever offered to help me. I'm sorry I disappeared," said Mrs. Richardson. "I got scared." Sheldon nodded. He hadn't come here at all to blame the old woman and make her feel guilty. "Mrs. Richardson, what happened to Haley? Why was she bedridden?" asked Sheldon. The woman looked at Sheldon, her lips pressed together, her eyes filled with tears, and her chin quivered. She sat down on the porch and rested her head on her hands. "I'll tell you, son, but I know there's no justice in this world, and I can't get it because we tried. I asked for compensation from the courts and the police, but I never got anything," Mrs. Richardson said as she recalled the horrific events that took place in their lives 5 years ago. Haley came home as usual. She left work an hour early because it was her grandmother, Mrs. Richardson's, birthday. It was a warm September evening, and there were lots of people on the streets. Haley was being followed by a local policeman. He had been giving her signs of attention for a long time, but she didn't like him at all. Besides, the man was married and Haley wasn't looking to break up someone else's family. Mrs. Richardson began to explain. That day Scott didn't want to listen to her denials. He was drunk and became insistent on the girl's attention. He promised her mountains of gold. He told her that she would be safe behind a stone wall beside him, and that she only needed a protector to protect her from the harassment of the precinct's very own. Scott followed Haley to her front porch. She was very scared, but tried not to show it. She calmly talked to the man and tried to explain to him why nothing could happen between them, and then he got angry and attacked her. The doors in the apartment were too deaf and most of the tenants were elderly people with poor hearing. No one heard the girl's screams as Scott raped her. When Haley broke free of his grip, she tripped and rolled headlong down the stairs, Mrs. Richardson recalls with a heavy heart. "My granddaughter was in intensive care for weeks. She was treated for a long time. We tried to put the bastard in jail, but he denied everything. He accused my little girl of offering herself to him. Scott remained innocent thanks to his acquaintances, and we received no compensation. We were ready to accept the money because Haley needed urgent and expensive spinal surgery. And then an idea popped into my head," Mrs. Richardson continued. Mrs. Richardson once again came home from the hospital. She didn't know where to get the money for the operation, but she couldn't leave her granddaughter lying there. Then she remembered a small cottage that a neighbor offered her for a small price. Mrs. Richardson called the neighbor and arranged to see the cottage. When she entered it, her first thought was to run away. The living conditions there were terrible, but the woman remembered her granddaughter and agreed. She sold the apartments, bought a dacha, and invested the remaining money in Haley's surgery. Doctors said that the operation was successful, but Haley did not get better. Then Mrs. Richardson went to another doctor, and he, after many examinations, said that the operation was unsuccessful. But the doctors tried to cover up their mistakes. They, in turn, denied everything and refused to do a second surgery for free, Mrs. Richardson explained, her voice shaking with excitement. Mrs. Richardson sighed heavily. "And my granddaughter and I are left in this house that gets worse and worse every year. Haley started receiving a disability pension, but it's very small. If we had my pension, it would only be enough for medicine and some food, so I have to ask for alms. It's hard for me to walk up to a person with my hand out every time, but I do it for my granddaughter. She and I are alone in the world, and now Haley is lying there, trying to get up, screaming in pain, falling down and crying. She cries for a long time out of helplessness, and then she tries to get up again, but it's not good for her because her spine is too weak. Mrs. Richardson concluded, tears streaming down her face. Sheldon listened silently to Mrs. Richardson's story, but kept his hands clenched into fists, wanting to punish all those responsible. He decided that he would definitely get justice even years later. "Mrs. Richardson, don't worry, you have me now and I will help you. You've helped us, now it's my turn to return the favor," Sheldon reassured her, determination in his voice. "Thank you, son. I will be indebted to you for the rest of my days, even though my life will be very short. I've already lived my life, and I shudder to imagine how Haley will live without me. Don't mind my illnesses because I only care about my little girl." Mrs. Richardson expressed her gratitude, her voice full of emotion. Sheldon entered the house to get a closer look at Haley. The woman had been afraid to look him in the eye for a long time, and when she did, she was mentally transported back to a distant past. She had looked at him with the same big green eyes then, but then she had been in a cradle and now she was on a bed, chained up. Mrs. Richardson told her granddaughter everything from the beginning, how she had met Sheldon and his mother and how she had now met him. It hurt the woman to hear that her grandmother had to ask for her. Haley wiped away her tears and promised that one day she would get back on her feet and make sure that her beloved grandmother never needed anything again. When Sheldon returned home, he immediately called his acquaintances and made arrangements for them to take up the case of Haley and the rapist, who was still at large. Sheldon hated people like that and was desperate for justice to be served. He called his surgeon friend and found out everything that would be needed to perform Haley's surgery. The next day, the girl was taken to the hospital where they began preparing her for surgery. Mrs. Richardson thought about Sheldon constantly, crying and saying that she would never have made it without him. Those who mishandled the first surgery were punished from day one. Sheldon's lawyers filed a lawsuit, and the hospital's chief medical officer launched an internal investigation to find those responsible and punish them. But the lawyers did not back down and demanded deserved punishment for everyone. Scott was caught in a dark alley, after which he was taught a good lesson by counting all his bones for what he had done to the girl. He was intimidated to such an extent that he was forced to run to the police with a clean confession, and soon he lost his credibility and ended up in the colony, where he was gladly welcomed by those he had once apprehended or framed. The man was guaranteed a hard life for the next 5 years. Sheldon bought Mrs. Richardson a cozy new home, and the woman cried. Sheldon actively tried to convince her that it was all her merit, that if it were not for her, he could now be in the penitentiary for theft, instead of sitting in the chair of the chief and have so much money. The man's mother arrived and helped the woman move into her new home while her granddaughter was in the hospital. Haley's surgery was successful, and for the first time in many years, the young woman had normal feeling in her limbs. She tried to follow all of the doctor's recommendations. Sheldon bought a wheelchair for Haley so that she could get around with it for the first time, and she was very grateful to the man for such help and support. A year later, Haley began to take steady steps and was able to get around without a wheelchair for a long time. Sheldon became a frequent visitor to Mrs. Richardson's house, and without noticing, he developed warm feelings for Haley. She charmed the man, and he dared to suggest that they start dating. Haley agreed to everything because she liked Sheldon as a person. He had a huge and kind heart, and she had been waiting for just such a man for years.